Irvin Studin, Global Brief Magazine, also the Institute for 21st Century Questions. Canada, post-pandemic, has count them, six crises of system. Let's discuss, and also let's discuss the fundamental change in national posture that's required in order for us to wrestle properly with these crises in their combination. All countries around the world have been touched by the coronavirus COVID-19 pandemic. All have performed differently, and all, of course, post-pandemic have different realities domestically. In the case of Canada, a major country with huge geography, with many, many complex internal moving parts, the crises are six. I repeat, six national crises of system for Canada post-pandemic. They are as follows: the pandemic, or public health more generally, the economy, education, institutions, a wicked international crisis, and a growing crisis of national unity post-pandemic. I wrote about this recently in La Presse in French, and I argued that the pandemic becomes the minor of our six crises of national system from this fall. Let's go through each and let's talk about how we exit, because the exit must be kinetic, it must be system-wide, and it must be informed by a sense of national mission, without which, if we reinforce a passive or fearful posture, we will not succeed. The destabilization of the country will continue. We will consolidate into what I call a strategic or an economic depression for a prolonged period of time. That is where we're heading now. And to pivot out, we must pivot with energy. For now, we're moving in the opposite direction, in part because we're not even framing our problems correctly. We're manifestly unaware of our circumstances and thinking too small about our problems. Everything is reduced to what I call the first crisis, the crisis of pandemic, public health more generally. So that consists in, obviously, the deaths and the illnesses and all the behavioral changes related to the pandemic. The pandemic, however, as the first crisis, has claimed 0.02% of the population in terms of deaths. 9,200 deaths at this time of filming on a population of 38 million. Now, to be clear, all of these cases of these lethal cases of COVID-19 in Canada, 9,200, are tragic, in many cases avoidable, not in all cases, but on a systems perspective, on the entire population, they represent 0.02%. Of the cases of infection, they represent less than 7%. Infection rates in Canada are 0.4%. All of these are very, very small numbers on a population of 38 million that has many other moving parts. However, our entire national energy, our psychology, our imagination, public resources, the info space has been reduced to a COVID count day by day that increasingly abstracts from what I would call even more serious problems. The public health crisis is much larger than COVID-19 today. It involves a huge crisis of public health, largely undiagnosed. And of course, all those pathologies, maladies, illnesses, and diagnoses that have been displaced or ignored or neglected as a result of the reduction in national focus to coronavirus alone. Those things add up to a large public health crisis, the scale of which is yet unknown. And yet I think that is the minor of our sixth crisis, because we get now to the second crisis, and that is the crisis in the economy. We have, on my reading of the numbers, effective unemployment in Canada of at least 20% across the country, 20%, spiraling upwards, not downwards, and this effective unemployment, underpinned by decreasing fiscal resources at all levels of government, especially local and provincial, a federal government that is in huge deficit position, huge indebtedness, huge debt position, but most importantly, more important than the deficit and the debt, is that the spending is largely either welfare-like spending, subsistence spending, naturally so because people have been quarantined or forced out of work and such, forced out of economic activity, but the multiplier of these fiscal expenditures is negligible, and therefore it's not sustainable, not even in the long term, in the medium term. We have effective borders across many jurisdictions in Canada. We have an Atlantic bubble that is now divorced from the rest of the internal market. We have a northern bubble in parts of the territories, divorced from the southern part of the country. And we have a closed border with our American partner for any foreseeable future, except for essential trade, certainly not for mobility and business transactions between people in person. That, on top of thousands of small and medium-sized businesses that have essentially been evaporated over the course of the quarantine or the Great Lockdown, makes for a gigantic crisis of economy, which, in my view, trumps the coronavirus crisis by many degrees of serious. By many, because therein lie families, self-worth, basic supply chains, including critical supplies and PPE over time, in the event that other crises should become more acute. So the economic crisis is a major world historical crisis for Canada, more significant than the public health crisis already, but getting worse. Now we get to the third crisis. In my view, the most tragic one and the most avoidable one is the crisis in education across many jurisdictions. Obviously, many kids were kept out of school across the country, as in many parts of the world, for several months, leading through to the summer. But by the fall, we have, in many cases, broken public systems as a result of an inability to understand our circumstance and where we're headed more generally. We have broken public systems that consist of in-person education for a majority of kids, online education for a plurality of kids, but in many cases, the proliferation of thousands, many thousands of pods and invented educational arrangements, largely unregulated, homeschooling, or the most tragic, in my view, unacceptable case, defection from the formal system altogether, unaccounted for, unregulated, and in many cases, irreversible. That is, kids that are growing up alongside your kids, my kids, and other Canadian kids. These are Canadian kids who are now defected from the Canadian system, who 4 or 5 years down the road will become adults and apparently functioning Canadians, or not. They are not being properly educated from this fall. An unacceptable situation in Canada, a developed country that should be thinking at a higher level given our history and of course our challenges to come. In the education case, we need to think about it not as the return to school being safe, but as a production line where we say, 5 years from now, where do we have to be as a country in terms of the education quality and results of our population? Are we preparing our young people for the Canada that's to come 5 years from now, which, by the way, will be a much more difficult Canada to manage, possibly a much poorer Canada, more destabilized one, and of course in a much more unstable world? Are we preparing these young people for success? Or have we only thought about the start line and neglected the fact that we need to be very kinetic, as I'll say at the end, in preparing these people more than ever, the entirety of the population, for success on the education front? So the education crisis is the third crisis, and obviously it's related to public health and the economy in ways that I think should be clear to Global Brief readers. Fourth crisis, undiagnosed, is a crisis of institutions in Canada. Parliament is not working effectively. Legislatures, the Assemblée nationale, the local level of the legislative branch, not working properly in terms of providing the feedback mechanisms from opposition or from the population to the executive branch, which is governing largely by decree and emergency posture. These feedback mechanisms that exist through Parliament, through legislatures, through the territorial assemblies, through the Assemblée nationale, are fundamental in Canadian democracy and in a democracy more generally. If they're not working, what's the point of the democracy? We might as well work in emergency mode, but be better. And we're not very good at emergency mode because we're not technocrats by discipline, and we don't have a totalitarian regime in Canada. So therefore, these feedback mechanisms need to be more powerful than ever in order to correct the mistakes of the executive branch, operating specifically on decree, on emergency decree, emergency governance, often through Zoom rooms, and divorced from the population. The connection between the ground and the center has been lost. The second part of the institutional crisis is the near total breakdown in the Canadian information space. That is, if Parliament, the legislatures, the Assemblée nationale, the territorial assemblies, all these local legislative fora are not providing meaningful feedback mechanisms, the media too is not providing accurate or effective feedback to power in our system. In large part because they're colonized by foreign algorithms. If we are operating on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and maybe even LinkedIn as our essential information spaces for reacting to the executive branch in a period of emergency, then we're operating by largely American-based algorithms with an American narrative, American facts largely, and American feeds and trends that inform a reality that is very different on the ground in Canada. What does the American information space have to do with Whitehorse, Inuvik, New Brunswick, Richmond Hill, or Richmond, BC? Nothing. And yet we have no Canadian feedback mechanisms that are providing muscular information to the center to improve their decision making in an emergency period. So we have a total breakdown in institutions that provide feedback mechanisms in a democratic country like Canada. Unacceptable situation. Fifth, the international crisis. This is probably manifest in terms of the anticipating the November presidential election, the growing anxiety on the Canadian side, perhaps especially about who's going to win, what the stability of the United States, our major neighbor, trading partner, ally, will be from early November, what the identity of the new president will be, what the decision-making of the new president will be, should Trump return, should Biden win, or of course should there be instability and uncertainty for the several subsequent months. This is one point, but it's a reduction again of much more complex international emergency, which is to say Canada already had a vassalizing posture and growing vassalization towards the United States. Now we have a closed border. We have domestic electoral instability on the American side. We have very, very difficult circumstances on our western border with China especially. And we have an Arctic space in which we also have an effective adversary or enemy in Russia. All combined, these are increasingly hostile borders for Canada, and it boxes us in ferociously. A country of 38 million with borders across, with closed borders on the south, a difficult border on the west, and a hostile border on the north at a time when, by the way, the north is increasingly opening up through climate change. These are historical circumstances of which I don't think we're seized. So we look at it from systems perspective, it is much more serious in the medium term than the pandemic alone. And finally, as if that weren't enough, the crisis in the domestic federation. Historically, Quebec has been a source of instability and tension. And it's, by the way, one of the unique things in Canada, the dance between Quebec and the rest of Canada. But that is not the central theater of national unity today, although it could be before long. The major theater is, of course, the West, concentrated on Alberta. If Alberta had difficult circumstances economically before the coronavirus, the level of frustration, alienation, anger there is, in my view, in many cases rightly, even larger post-pandemic. First, because of the physical distance from Ottawa, and Ottawa is not leaving the compound, as it were, not leaving the national capital center physically to meet Alberta when it's quarantined or when it's cut off from the international economy, the domestic economy. It's not meeting it physically, it's not meeting it psychologically, and of course economically Alberta is grinding, consolidating into also a very deep depression from which there are no signs of exit. So there's no reason for manifest hope except for exhortatory, except for declaration. And so Alberta is a point, Quebec is always a consideration, and then there are Aboriginal dynamics, Indigenous dynamics across the country that have yet to be dealt with through reconciliation, through legal process, through political processes. Alberta's the major one. It could become much more ferocious in the next couple of months if we don't pivot out meaningfully. So all six need to be taken together. We need to be better on the details, less declarations, more on the ground. We have to pivot out, not in a national stupor. What are we going to do? What are the numbers today? We need to pivot out with a sense of mission, because the pressures are huge. Our instruments are increasingly exhausted, but we are a great country, a long-standing country with a great future ahead of us. Now, let us pivot out kinetically, with energy, with a sense of mission, and start to ace those mission points systematically at the right level, 2020, 2021.